Welcome to the American Historical Association's congressional briefing on how U.S. history is taught in American public schools. I'm Jim Grossman. I'm the executive director of the American Historical Association. I want to thank everybody for coming. This morning's conversation will focus on controversies over history education in American public schools. You've no doubt seen reference to conflicts at school board meetings, legislative initiatives, outspoken interest groups like Moms for Liberty. The media have, on occasion, reported outrage, reported wild claims, and a growing sense of alarm in homes and communities across the country. I think it depends on where you are as to how much of this you've seen, how much of a sense of crisis, non-crisis. Loudoun County was one of the most highly publicized school board meeting conflicts, so some of us in this area have some sense of this. But what we now know is that it is more heat than light. This political theater and vigorous debate, until recently, lacked one important element: evidence drawn from careful research. There has been no place to go for a comprehensive analysis of the what, how, and why of middle and high school U.S. history instruction. Until now. The American Historical Association's research report, American Lesson Plan, was published last week. Dare I ask if anybody has read part of it? Wow. AHA staff, keep your hands down. Okay, again, I'm just curious. Okay, so a few of you. Great, wonderful. All 170 pages? It's interesting. There was a piece in the LA Times. When did that appear? Like 3 days ago? Friday. And it got the report completely wrong. And we realize, when you read the op-ed carefully, you realize that actually the person even admits that he hasn't read one word of it. But actually he advertised this, which was very nice, except it really doesn't matter in Los Angeles to advertise this. The report has already received attention in the New York Times, in the Los Angeles Times. It will be the focus of gatherings convened by national organizations of historians, social studies teachers, the education policy community, but you're getting to hear the conversation first because you're in DC. We're going to begin with the leader of the AHA's research team for this initiative, Nicholas Krishka. Nick taught high school social studies in the Chicago public schools for a decade and has developed K-12 history curriculum for the Newberry Library and the Chicago Collections Consortium. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Chicago and is working on a book on the history of education reform in late 20th century Chicago. He'll be followed by Brenda Santos, who is Director of Research Practice Partnerships at the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. Brenda wins the title for the longest title today. She earned her PhD in education at the University of Rhode Island. She has taught high school, has worked as a social studies teacher education at several universities, and served as a district-level social studies director. So when you see references in the report to mid-level bureaucrats, that's Brenda. She is also a former member of the American Historical Association's Governing Council. Our final speaker will be Jonathan Zimmerman. John, your title's longer than Brenda's. Jonathan is the Judy and Howard Berkowitz Professor in Education Policy, Organizations, Leadership, and Systems Division at the University of Pennsylvania. And he also has an appointment as Professor of History. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher, he is the author of Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools, and 8 other books. And because he is not very busy writing books, he also writes op-eds at a ridiculous pace, publishing them in newspapers across the country. How many different, it's like also like 30 different cities, right? I mean, yeah, right. The AHA's congressional briefings provide congressional staff, journalists, and others in the policy community with historical background necessary to understand the context of current legislative concerns. The program rests on a very simple premise. Everything has a history, including issues that are either on the congressional agenda or occasionally should be on that calendar. Careful historical contextualization of issues relating to the work of Congress, your work, is not only possible, it is essential. Our second premise, aside from the fact that if you don't know the historical context, you ought not to be saying anything. Our second premise is that it's possible to provide that historical context in a manner that is nonpartisan and unencumbered with a particular legislative agenda. Now, this briefing will diverge slightly from that usual caution, as we do have an agenda here. We can't possibly have a congressional briefing on a report that we wrote and not have an agenda, because obviously that 170 pages somewhere advocates for something. We do have an agenda. All Americans, no matter where one lives, who one votes for, or how one spends their time, all Americans have a stake in a citizenry that knows the nation's history. And we similarly have a stake in the ability of everyone to think historically. That means understanding such things as change, context, diversity of human experience, and historical empathy. Our nation's social studies teachers need the resources, especially professional development, to teach this history with the professionalism that they bring to their jobs. To understand this argument, you can read the 170 pages of the report, or you could just listen attentively this morning. You can also ask questions. You have index cards on your seat on which we invite you to scroll questions as you listen. They will be picked up by AHA staff members, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. A quick reminder as you listen, everything does have a history. And if you and your colleagues are wrestling with a challenging issue and need historical context, let us know. The AHA has roughly 10,500 members. We assure you, and I'm willing to make this claim, we can find three, maybe in some cases two, we can find 2 or 3 good, highly qualified historians to speak on anything. So if there is something that you or your colleagues would like us to do a briefing on, please let us know, and we'll take a look and see if we can do this, since we will be continuing this program next year. So, let's start with Nick.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Good morning, and thank you, everyone, for being here and for this opportunity to share this research. First, this to Jim's point about the stakes. Can I get a show of hands? How many of you took a U.S. history course in your middle school or high school experience? Okay. How many of you took that course in the 21st century? Okay. How many of you have a member of your immediate family who is currently enrolled in a U.S. history course, either in middle or high school? You. Okay, excellent. So I just wanted to remind people of the stakes and the fact that all of you are invested in this question. So I'm going to take us back a little bit to the turn of the 2020s, so this current decade. And there was an urgent question circulating in national media, put this way. What on earth are American school children being taught about our nation's history? Progressives and conservatives, activists and centrists, all wanted answers. In one sense, this was a really good news question. It meant that Americans appeared to care deeply about history education. The bad news, as Jim suggested, was that too many seemed content to answer the questions in service of partisan tastes and without ever surveying the terrain where actual history teaching took place. So in 2022, we at the American Historical Association decided to take this question literally and launched a 2-year study of the national U.S. history teaching landscape. Our task was put to us simply: establish an empirical grounding for these debates. What was actually happening? Were teachers, as some feared, whitewashing history in service of patriotism? Or were they, as others claimed, brainwashing children against their own country? As we immediately realized, these were the wrong questions. The culture war swirling around American history had hidden the real dynamics of curricular governance from view. In the American education system, which is diverse, devolved, and dynamic, there are as many points for decision-making about history curriculum as there are states, as there are schools, school districts, as there are schoolhouses, as there are teachers. To get an accurate picture, we had to crawl our way across and between all these various levels, combining a 50-state overview of academic standards and lawmaking with a 9-state deep dive into local contexts where we surveyed 3,000 teachers, interviewed hundreds more, and appraised tens of thousands of pages of instructional material that we got directly from schools and districts. After that, we feel pretty well qualified to answer that opening question: what on earth are school children learning about their nation's past? And so, as Jim says, we hope that you'll take a look at our report. But in case you don't, I'm going to give you 5 big takeaways this morning to share with you. So first, apathy, not activism, is what many teachers spend their time trying to overcome among their students and among parents, and sometimes even among administrators. With the exception of some definite hotspots, teachers we engaged with don't typically encounter politicized pressure at their job. Far from fending off throngs of critics, the typical social studies teacher struggles to get parents, students, and administrators to care about history at all. Only 2% of surveyed teachers reported that they regularly faced direct criticism related to the way they teach topics in U.S. history. When asked to describe how their subject was valued in their school district, teachers echoed each other's favorite euphemisms: pushed to the wayside, put on the back burner, always an afterthought, and so on. Now, this data is going to give cold comfort to teachers who actually have the misfortune of working in school districts where overbearing administrators or organized activists have pushed an ideological agenda, or where an ambient sense of political pressure has spooked teachers away from topics that they unnecessarily now perceive as controversial. Stories of political pressure that we encountered were almost always localized, and there were certainly examples of both conservatives and progressives pushing unproductive initiatives that threatened the integrity of good history teaching. But as we found, most history teachers aren't even on the battlefield of these conflicts, let alone taking up arms as combatants. What distinguishes good history teachers is the sense of self-awareness and self-restraint that allows them to maintain the integrity, their integrity as trusted brokers of historical truth. In interviews, we heard repeatedly about these commitments: to teach students how to think and not what to think, to commit to teaching both inspirational and hard histories, to engage with multiple perspectives. Preparing students for critical thinking and informed citizenship, which are the top educational goals among the teachers that we surveyed, inclines them to keep a political poker face in the classroom and to avoid curricular materials that they associate with ideological bias. This is the good news that no one is talking about. The bad news is that history teachers continue to perceive the sidelining of history in favor of subjects regularly covered by state-mandated exams. And so this brings me to a second claim, which is that history teachers retain substantial discretion over what they use in their daily work. The accountability movement in U.S. education certainly pulled state paperwork into successive rounds of standardization beginning in the 1990s. By 2002, all but 2 states had a set of adopted standards for social studies. Meanwhile, school administrators have made course team alignment, which is to say getting all the teachers on a particular class on the same page, a professional goal for well over a generation. But standardized testing, which is the decisive variable in aligning instructional practice to any standard, landed unevenly and irresolutely for history in most states. So with a few exceptions, state-mandated testing in U.S. history remains a low-stakes oddity today. And I'm happy to talk more about those exceptions and about the benefits and trade-offs that flow from assessment mandates later on in the conversation. As for state standards, some teachers deeply appreciate when their state has a set of high-quality standards to guide instruction, especially early in their career. But a great many teachers carry on with minimal awareness and occasional antagonism to the state education agency's alleged role in their work. Even at the district level, administrators cannot claim extensive control over the details of U.S. history instruction. So what then do history teachers do with all this discretion? Our third claim may seem counterintuitive, that in spite of all of these localized structures of governance, infrequent common assessment, and loose chains of management, history teachers end up on common ground, choosing and using many of the same instructional materials as their peers across the national landscape. Traditional textbooks are moving to the margins of history instruction, driven chiefly by technology, and a growing perception among many teachers that the current generation of students are either unprepared or unwilling to read at length. 32% of teachers said that they never use a textbook, and those that do are more likely to describe them as a reference than something that they assign regularly in class or for homework. Instead, U.S. history teachers draw from a common pool of trusted sources and activities accessed chiefly by way of online providers. Legislators here in the nation's capital should be proud to learn that high rates of reported recognition and usage clustered around the digital resources of federal museums, archives, and institutions, like the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian, for example. Also near the top of the list, I'm going to give you two names that maybe you probably would not hear of unless you were a history teacher, and those two names are Sam Weinberg and John Green. Do those names ring a bell for anybody? Okay, some people are actually nodding their heads. Okay, so one of these guys, Sam Weinberg, is a cognitive psychologist who runs a curriculum developer called the Digital Inquiry Group, or DIG, but it's formerly and more popularly known as SHEG, which is the Stanford History Education Group. And John Green is a YouTuber and a fiction writer who runs a YouTube channel called The Crash Course U.S. History. So SHEG and Crash Course, these are among the more popularly used resources by many of the teachers that we surveyed, but they're also a really good shorthand for this kind of split personality that history teaching has at its core. So if you take SHEG, you have classroom-ready document-based inquiry activities. So document-based inquiry is the kind of phrase I'll use to describe this. And in that world, history is a way of reading and arguing about documents. In Crash Course videos, history is a dynamic narrative, a fast-paced story with plot points and key characters. So the successful history teacher, of course, does both, tells a true story and teaches students how true stories are made. But good stories rely on good questions and good sources. So our prolonged exposure to a variety of bad questions and dismembered documents led us to a fourth claim. Fourth claim is that this mostly productive focus on inquiry may have some collateral costs. At the end of the last century, experts in social studies promised to move us away from endless battles over which history was going to be taught and onto a discussion of why history should be taught. And so the new resources that emerged gave teachers clearer guidance to help students inquire, think, read, and argue like historians than ever before. And this emphasis on inquiry and literacy kept the culture wars at bay and justified social studies on terms compatible with federal accountability initiatives like No Child Left Behind, Common Core, and Race to the Top. Social studies standards in multiple states now echo the 2013 College Career and Civic Life, or C3 framework, centering inquiry as both process and goal. On the ground, however, document-based inquiry doesn't always match the ideal form. The typical document-based lesson, in some anyway, sources come plucked from original contexts, trimmed to snippets, and even altered by AI. Instead of a textured and stirring encounter with the past, many lessons are designed toward more instrumental outcomes. Assess the validity of the evidence, extract the main idea, use this detail to support this claim. Meanwhile, prompts that organize inquiry units often soar in the opposite direction, posing big, compelling, or essential questions that raise the stakes to civic or philosophical dimensions. How should democracy work? Is compromise always fair? These are certainly compelling questions, great questions, but they may be best worked out in the present tense by, I don't know, maybe people who work in the U.S. Congress, rather than in a middle school history lesson. Historical figures and events are too often tossed into a game of forced choices. Triumph or tragedy, hero or villain, reducing history to a set of positions that students must take and defend. We look forward to an ongoing dialogue among historians, educators, and the public that can sharpen our collective understanding of the difference between good historical questions, ahistorical questions, and the questions that history cannot answer for us. And this brings me to our final claim, which is that history teachers desire and deserve more high-quality, content-specific professional development. Teachers who took professional development trips spoke glowingly of these experiences, the enrichment and community that they had gained, but experience with these opportunities was uneven, with descriptions of access, approval, and funding for history PD varying widely across district settings, except for the common refrain that district-organized PD rarely focused on history content. And I'm happy to elaborate later on the history topics that we actually studied in detail, but I want to stress that the missteps that we found in classroom materials rarely expressed a partisan slant. Weak points that we came across were in acts of simplification, expressive of the need to rush through a topic, or indicative of a lack of background knowledge in certain areas, which teachers were very comfortable admitting, like there's certain things I know better and others that I don't. The expiration of the Federal Teaching American History Grant Program in 2011 has left professional development among K-12 history teachers underfunded for over a decade. Any new initiative will doubtlessly face difficulty navigating these hotspots and third rails of contemporary culture wars. But we think, an ideal program of targeted professional development for U.S. history teachers should focus on reinforcing teachers' confidence as authentic experts in their subject matter, moving fluently between those two sides of the history coin that I described, the inquiry and the narrative, kind of the John Green and the Sam Weinberg version of themselves. In the end, our report makes a strong case that it's time to change the subject again. In place of hyperbole about who is or isn't brainwashing children or whitewashing history, our research proposes a new set of debates about how to preserve the distinctive benefits of learning history amidst broader trends in literacy and technology, about how to negotiate boundaries of authority over instruction, and about how history-rich professional development for teachers can be funded and sustained over the long haul. And none of these debate topics map comfortably onto red and blue boundaries set by partisan media. All the better. One insight that we have learned while studying K-12 education is that panic is poison. We declare no crisis, we propose no overhaul. Even as we criticize some lessons that made us cringe, we charge no one with any crimes against history. People like yourselves who serve in government, whether here in DC or in the State House or on the local school board, should continue to vigorously debate what kids need to learn about our nation's past. We are thrilled that people care enough about history to argue about it. But these debates can only proceed productively with a full view of what the historical record contains and on a shared view of what our current classrooms are actually teaching. And on both counts, historians are here to help. Thanks.
Before Brenda starts, quick question. Nick asked how many of you, something about taking a history class. How many of you remember your high school history class being exciting and enticing you to take another class when you went to college? That's good. How many of you recall your high school history class as boring? This is progress.
Yep.
This is wonderful.
How many of you have been teachers yourselves?
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll do our little public polling, you see, right?
I have also been a high school history teacher myself, and a teacher educator, and as Jim lovingly put it, a mid-level bureaucrat in a school system. And I'm currently a education researcher who works at a policy institute, thinks a lot about how policy relates to the conditions of school and student learning and teacher practice. So I brought those perspectives to the reflections that I'll share today. I'll start by saying I could have shared a lot of things because this report is so rich, and I do urge you, especially those of you who've worked in history education and have that interest, to look at the report more fully. There's a lot to talk about here. The American Lesson Plan report shows that U.S. history classrooms don't look like the caricatures of history instruction held up by critics on both ends of the political spectrum. Classrooms are not sites of indoctrination. Students are not subjected to politically motivated distortions or omissions. Rather, the report illustrates that U.S. history teachers anchor in curriculum frameworks that vary in some ways, often related to their location, but those frameworks largely cover the same widely accepted content. This report helps us to see what is emphasized in U.S. history classrooms and by U.S. history teachers. What I heard in the voices of the many teachers quoted in the report was an emphasis on sharing multiple perspectives while maintaining a neutral role, the use of primary source documents to answer historical questions, and a focus on teaching students how to think rather than what to think. While the report didn't find evidence of political indoctrination in U.S. history classrooms, it did identify a persistent and concerning under-resourcing of history teachers. That under-resourcing takes three main forms: insufficient curricular materials, inadequate professional development, and limited attention or respect for history within the instructional program, often corresponding to limited classroom time for history instruction, but also corresponding to supervision by administrators who are not expert in their discipline. Being under-resourced is one condition of teachers' work. Navigating pressures from both the political realm and local school administrators is another. Put together, it appears that many teachers are simultaneously working amongst themselves to prepare materials and lessons while fending off or blocking out those of us on the outside with critiques, mandates, and new initiatives. In thinking about the implications of the report, and particularly in our efforts to remedy the under-resourcing of history teachers, it's imperative that we listen to the subtler insights in this rich, full portrait of U.S. history teaching and learning. The first such insight begins with the idea that history is an inquiry-based discipline that requires deep engagement with content knowledge. The report explains how the strongest U.S. history teachers teach students the thinking skills involved in historical analysis by presenting them with true historical questions, primary source documents, and relevant content knowledge. Indeed, the report shows that most teachers understand history to be about teaching both historical thinking skills and knowledge of the past. As the report also shows, teachers' efforts to combine rich content and historical thinking are undermined when political interests scrutinize the former and call into question the latter as a kind of moral relativism or precursor to social activism. As concerning, some school administrators, in efforts to skirt controversy over content, encourage inquiry without the rigor of deep content engagement. Others push teachers to embrace a form of inquiry instruction that provides students with practice for informational reading tasks on standardized tests that are part of their accountability structure. On the other end of the continuum, teachers report that their standards contain an impossible amount of content to deliver, a recipe for a focus on coverage, especially with limited classroom time. In thinking about what solutions we might pursue to remedy the under-resourcing of teachers, we must keep in mind these tendencies of our political discourse and our administrative mechanisms to stand in teachers' way, especially when their teaching reflects the simple but nuanced consensus that history instruction is about both knowing and thinking. Another critical insight of this report emerges from its detailed analysis of curriculum and its use. When choosing their own materials, teachers seem to bring a range of diverse selection criteria to the project. No doubt they select materials for accessibility for students, convenience for themselves and their students, and alignment with their content objectives. A resource's political bent seems to rarely attract a teacher to a source. The report describes the thoughtful way that teachers scrutinize and largely reject curricular materials they see as politically motivated. Within this analysis of curriculum, I'd urge education leaders and policymakers to pay close attention to the report's description of 3 curriculum reform efforts. One in Illinois using a custom digital curriculum, another in Washington using project-based learning, and a third in Colorado centered on document analysis. Through these examples, the report shows that even when districts tailor their curriculum mandates to local needs, heavy-handed centralized efforts have a tendency to disempower teachers. The authors write, administrators are right to be concerned about the quality and rigor of in-use materials, but overbearing standardization runs counter to the long-standing and widely embraced goal of social studies, to foster new generations of independent thinking, self-governing citizens. If teachers are too regimented to enact these habits as professionals, they will have little hope of modeling them for their students. I would add that if we admit to another subtle finding of this report, that where U.S. history instruction is excellent, it is because of teachers, then we owe it to them to attend to the needs this report reveals. This report indicates a need for curricular resources that reflect the careful reasoning historians do when they bring knowledge to bear on evidence from the past. History instruction should mirror this work not because students are going to be historians, but because understanding our history requires both knowledge of the past and the ability to see connections and complexities when faced with evidence. At the same time, curriculum material must be accessible for secondary students and practical for K-12 classrooms. Sheg and Tom Green have one thing very much in common, and that's that they were both designed with the K-12 student in mind. This will require much more investment in collaborations between historians, education scholars, expert on teaching and learning, and practitioners who know what it's like to actually teach adolescents and teachers in schools. I have been involved in such a collaboration for the last 4 years, and it feels like nothing less than swimming upstream against the current. In addition to curriculum, this report indicates a need for investment in content-specific professional development for U.S. history teachers. In the summer after my first year of teaching, I joined a group of U.S. history teachers at the archives of Amherst College to learn with the historians David Blight and the late James Horton. That experience and others like it were indispensable to my development as a high school U.S. history teacher who could bring together content and historical skill building in the classroom. Last week, in a conversation with a superintendent, I asked about the various ways the district did professional development. After describing the district's PD, the superintendent noted with concern that teachers had less access to content-specific training than they had in the past. The evidence shows that a key characteristic of effective professional development is that it is grounded in specific content, even connected to specific instructional materials. But history teachers are rarely offered PD opportunities that meet this criterion. How are they to develop the needed skills, like that essential skill of posing historical questions, without greater investment in the professional learning of U.S. history teachers? Research also tells us that effective professional learning brings teachers together with peers who have expertise, as well as with experts from outside their teams. The report found teachers eager to collaborate. Let's help facilitate the connections between teachers and historians, and let's make sure these collaborations have the curricular resources and the time that they need. Finally, to address the under-resourcing of U.S. history teachers, we will need to elevate the status of history teaching and learning in K-12 without falling prey to the pitfalls that can come with our go-to means of attention, those in the assessment and accountability paradigms. We can take heart that despite a chaotic curricular landscape and pressures from both within and outside schools, this report found that teachers are diligently working every day to help their students learn. The actions we take to remedy the under-resourcing of U.S. history teachers revealed in this report should line us up beside them.
Thank you, Brenda. Okay, next question. How many of you either live in school districts or have family in school districts or went to school in school districts where people are fighting over the content of history education? Just curious. So not very many. Okay. And how many of you have been, whether it's at family dinners or whatever, where there's been an assumption that the word revisionism is a negative term? That's not bad. Only, okay. I was stimulated to ask that by your reference to Jim Horton. Jim Horton used to say every chance he got with public audiences, he would ask this question about revisionism, and people would, this horrible thing, revisionism is where people make stuff up. And he would simply look out at the audience and say, do you want to get cut up by a heart surgeon who hasn't been reading revisionist medicine? And that, yeah, exactly. And that's a little reminder to people about the importance of revisionist history. John?
Yeah, good. Thank you. First of all, it's great to be in the same room with so many future members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Yeah. We also have 2 future presidents. We just don't know who they are. Yeah.
So how many of you work for a member who was once a staffer or an intern? Okay, see, there you go, John.
Yeah, there we go. Right, so there they are, yeah. Also, I want to thank Nick and his colleagues for just doing a bang-up job on this report. It is 170 pages long, but there are a lot of gems in those 170 pages, and also excellent graphics, which I think really matter. And also, I just want to give a huge shout out to Jim Grossman. He's ending his brilliant tenure as the executive director of our association, and he's been a great advocate for the profession in all of its iterations, and also a great public servant, and that's what this event is about. I read this report, and I felt like I have to do a kind of mea culpa. I'm also a journalist, as Jim mentioned, and we have a phrase in that trade, if it bleeds, it leads. And, he mentioned that I wrote a book about the culture wars in American schools, which I updated in a 20th edition, because we have had a lot of them. But I think I exaggerated their breadth and maybe even their import. They are real. We've all read about them. But they don't characterize the day-to-day lives of most American teachers. And I think what all of us need to do is we have to find a register where we acknowledge those threats and we reply to them without exaggerating them. And I think in today's political environment, that's just a hard thing to do. Like acknowledge that there are some teachers who feel afraid to talk about the question of gender in history, because there are states that have banned discussions of gender identity. That is real. That is a problem. Gender is obviously an important category in American historical study, but that's not the modal experience of American high school teachers or middle school teachers. So I think we have to acknowledge both of that, and also the fact that the vast majority of our school teachers are making a good faith effort to teach kids how to think, not what to think. That's obviously at the heart of the small L liberal ideal. And I read this report with, frankly, a lot of pride in America and a lot of pride in the people that teach about America. I think they're doing the very best they can to hold on to that ideal, to teach it, to exemplify it, to preserve it. I should say, as a scholar of the history of schools, I was also both surprised and gratified to read how much autonomy teachers have. Because, a big theme in the history of American education, which is my scholarly specialty, is about the way that another profession, namely administrators, lorded it over teachers and inhibited their autonomy. That too is real, but I think it's possible to exaggerate it as well. And I think all of us, again, need to find a register where we acknowledge that sometimes teachers are actually bridling under the thumb of dictatorial administrators, and that's real and that's a problem. But that's also not the modal experience, at least not for history teachers, who exert a great deal of autonomy in their classroom and also in their choice of materials. And that is the other, I think, great surprise. A lot of my own scholarly work is focused on textbooks because it's kind of easy. It's not easy to read them because they're really boring, right? But it's easy to use as kind of a locus of controversy because there have been and continue to be wars over textbooks. But most history teachers don't use them anymore. They use all these online materials, and that's a complicated dynamic in its own right. Because, of course, I want teachers to have autonomy, but and I'll get to this in a moment, I think they need more and a different kind of preparation to exert that autonomy in a constructive way. It's a big, wild West landscape out there of online materials. And as you might guess, they're of variable quality, variable accuracy. But at the same time, and I know this is just a dweeby historian thing to say, I was also intrigued by how much commonality there is among the choices the teachers are making. And this, friends, is one of the fascinating things about studying American education. All of you work on the Hill, most of you do, you know we actually don't have a national education system. And we never have. Yet at the same time, there's astonishing consistency in terms of a lot of what we do in American schools. You know, the dweeby historians call this the grammar of schooling. That is the kind of taken for granted assumptions about what a school is, what it looks and feels like. And there's astonishing uniformity across that. You know, there are 7 class periods. It begins around 8 in the morning, goes to 3. The subject matter that's required is pretty consistent, even though there's no law or no measure requiring that, which I think is interesting and fascinating. So I don't want to repeat what the others have said because I'm much more interested in hearing what you have to say, but let me just say a few other things, takeaways, and then a question. The big takeaway, as both Brenda and Nick mentioned, is that the teachers need more time and they need more assistance, especially regarding content. Jim mentioned I was a Peace Corps volunteer. When I came back to the United States in 1986, I started teaching in northwestern Vermont because that's where my girlfriend, blessedly since then my wife, was in medical school. And I was the new social studies teacher, and they said, "Congratulations, you're teaching Canadian studies." And what I knew about Canada, you can fit into a thimble. Americans know nothing about Canada. When the baseball pitcher Mark Langston was traded to the Expos before they were the Nationals, somebody asked him, you know, how he liked it, and he said, "It's like another country up there." You know, and I just knew it had like weird names like Medicine Hat, and that people played a lot of hockey, and that was it. That's a problem, right? It's a problem that somebody who knew nothing about Canada was enjoined to teach about it. And, you know, you can always criticize a report for what isn't in it, and this is not a criticism, but what isn't in this report are some big questions about who becomes a teacher and how they get prepared to do that. How much history do they learn? The answer to that question varies across states and localities, but in some cases, the answer is very little. And this is a huge problem that all of us need to think about. The other question that I'd just like to ask, again, not in the report, and it shouldn't be, is how history compares to other disciplines. Obviously, this is an event sponsored by the American Historical Association. Everybody up here is a historian. But I think I read somewhere that there are other disciplines. They're not as good, obviously, but they exist. And I do wonder what a report, say, about ELA, about, say, literature instruction would look like now. It may look very different from this. So, you know, Jim mentioned Loudoun County. As I understand it, the big ban on Loudoun County wasn't over history instruction, it was over whether to teach a Toni Morrison novel. And it may well be that English teachers are under a very different set of pressures than history teachers are. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
Okay, so all of you have index cards on your chairs, so please, if you have a question, scribble it. Ben, and then I also will kind of stroll around and see what what you have to say, and then we'll ask the panel. But I have a question for the panel while people are scribbling. So John talked about what surprised him and what even made him change his mind. Nick, you spent 2.5 years on this. Did anything in this work make you change your mind about anything?
Well, it certainly it brought new information to light for me, given that so as Jim said in the introduction, I was a high school social studies teacher for 10 years. Those 10 years were 2003 to 2013. And I was legitimately surprised by how thoroughly the tech revolution had overtaken the way that teachers access resources. So at the time that I left the classroom, we were certainly accessing a lot of stuff online, and there were great web resources out there. But I think what is really different is just on the management side in school districts, how much of the material is now sitting on what they call an LMS, learning management system, that in some cases is firewalled and guarded by admins and makes it difficult for those of us in the public to get access to it, which I think is unfortunate. But that tech context, I think, was really important, and obviously the COVID moment supercharged a lot of these tech trends. So the movement of so much onto digital platforms, that was a big surprise to me.
Brenda, when in reading this, anything that surprised you and anything that nudged you to change your mind about something?
I think that I'll share one. So I've been involved in curricular development in history education for many years, and it's brought me in close contact with a lot of teachers who I would say are if you were to rank teachers on how successfully they're able to do really strong middle or high school history instruction, they're at the very tippity top. And I think it skewed, Nick and I think have felt this in our conversations where my sense is that teachers are doing better than they are. And I think that's shaped by the kinds of teachers that I interact with. Very veteran teachers, relatively veteran teachers, relatively successful teachers. And so I was most surprised by just the huge proportion of people who are relying, in my view, overly on materials not created in any connection to the historical discipline, things like Crash Course, but other products like that.
Teachers pay teachers.
Teachers pay teachers.
Drunk history. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm also the parent of a high school student who's in his second high school history class right now, and have seen his teacher's reliance on these resources. So I think, the question of, or the challenge of fitting, it's not new that the connection between high quality resources that are connected with history, the discipline, the connection between those and K-12 has been a challenge before modern technology. That's not an entirely new challenge. But I think technology has exacerbated that challenge. So this idea of fitting the resources in a way where teachers can actually see them being useful with middle and high school students is something that I, as a person who works in curriculum development projects, underestimated, and I think we have to think a lot more about that. I facilitated Brown's first reading with first-year students a couple of months ago. And the first reading was was delivered to students in a fully digital format this year. So I think for all of us, not just in K-12, but in higher ed as well, need to think about new ways that students are reading, the kind of advantages, but also challenges of that, and how we preserve things like, rigorous text-based discussions when navigation makes it such that we can't actually look at the same text at the same time. So I think there's a lot there to talk more about.
So, Brenda, you actually anticipated one of the questions, and so let's nudge a little bit on this. Do we need to teach U.S. history differently for the TikTok generation? Less reading, more video. Exactly what you were just suggesting. Is there a different are there different priorities and also different talents that students have? There's a lot of moaning about the lack of talent. People don't read, but this also suggests maybe different talents. So anyway, what do we do differently now that we know that the students walking into our classrooms are accustomed to finding and processing information in different ways? How do we adapt to that?
Well, if you want my answer, you can just follow me on Instagram.
Instagram is, you're obviously over 50.
I'm really into MySpace too, yeah. Yeah.
Any of you?
I mean, I think it's a tough challenge because I think there were definitely times when we would see certain, I don't know, snippets of robust text in lessons that had been just taken completely out of their context and modularized into these little activities, and we would look at it and be like, well, what's the point, right? What's the point of having this primary document if it's just sitting there as a little hunt and peck reading exercise? That's not how I, as a history teacher or a historian, think about the value of primary sources. On the other hand, there's a very real challenge that teachers are facing, which is like these kids cannot decode this text even if I just plop this giant tome in front of them. So I need to slice it up and modularize and scaffold with them. So, I think there is, it provokes other questions about differentiation of instruction and about tracking even, and about what it means to have a classroom where not everybody is, able to read at the same level. So these are challenges that teachers face, and they kind of improvise their own solutions to that. I have, memories of teachers we interviewed who talked about having a set of students with really low reading levels, and he kind of improvised these cartoon lessons as a way to keep the narrative part of history alive, but they were basically creating narrative through picture. So it's a challenge that teachers are solving on their own out there. But I'd be curious to hear what Brenda says, being in the kind of curriculum development world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's one thing that I say when I'm working with teachers trying to implement curriculum often is that there's a difference that it's helpful to think about accessing a text separately from analyzing a text. And when teachers sort of work to make a text more accessible, they need to be, and this is why the training is so important, teachers need to understand really well what the worthwhile analysis, what the thinking is that's there, that they're engaging students in, right? The learning happens when the students are grappling with something that's challenging. And so if teachers mistake providing access for literally making something easier, which is not what it's not what the project of providing access is about, then they essentially remove the learning from the exercise. So there's teacher skill building here that is highly, I think this is a theme of our morning, highly content specific, right? Teachers can't make these choices unless they understand. And I hope you heard a not so subtle warning against a swing toward over-prescriptive curriculum. I mean, that trend is happening in other disciplines, and the implication of this report is not, to this point, there's no emergency here. This is not teachers are DIYing it, and so we need to give them scripted lesson plans. That is not what is happening here. In fact, it's the opposite. It's that teachers are already making good decisions. They need help to make better decisions, and that help needs to be a deeper understanding of what is the thinking that they're trying to help students to develop. What is the knowledge that they're trying to help students to develop so that they can make those good choices? And then we've just got to give them, I love the recipes and ingredients. They just need better ingredients to work with. From those of us, and those ingredients can't be to belabor the metaphor, they can't be ingredients you have to go to a specialty store for, right? Or that you've got to alter in some way. They've got to be ingredients that actually are around and work in the kitchens they're working in, right? Work with the students that they're working with.
I mean, the only thing I'd add there, since Brenda used the metaphor script, what I think is so fascinating about the report is how actually so many people are following the same script. Like, it's not a prescribed script, and it shouldn't be. But they are, just because of the way the culture works. I mean, beneath this question about the TikTok generation, I think there's a much bigger one that transcends the bounds of this history discussion. I mean, Brenda said she was surprised at how many teachers, just rely on the online space, right, for their resources. But it seems to me that's an entirely different question from the role of digital technologies in instruction. They're related, but they're different. And, you know, I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that people don't read as well on screens as in print. There's a lot of evidence that screens distract students in profoundly unhelpful ways. There are associations between screen use and depression, although there's debate about what direction the causal hours go in. So those are all things we need to be thinking about, all those things.
And Brenda, since Brenda liked the meal and restaurant metaphor, we need to give credit where credit is due. When we first started this project, and we actually did ask other people for suggestions and help, and John was one of the first people we went to. So the restaurant metaphor does come from John.
Yeah, and
we did not create it.
I mean, this is a report about the recipe. It's not about the meal. You know, it's about the different standards that we've created, the different curricula we use. But the meal, how instruction actually takes place, it's an even more complicated matter.
So, okay, next, because the card I've just been handed said we need to be out of here at 10:05. How did this comes, I think, out of your answer to the last question, Brenda? How do teachers, or I would say how do and how can teachers analyze quality and/or partisan leanings of the digital resources that are out there? You've got your teacher on Sunday night. We have our little chart there that says what teachers go to. But how can a teacher, when they're sitting there looking for stuff, decide that a site is high quality and that it is partisan or non, or less ideological or less ideological? How can they make those decisions, and how do they?
Yeah, I mean, on the quality question is maybe a little more complicated to get into, but I was reassured in general by both our survey data and our conversations with teachers that their radar with regard to ideological or partisan messaging is pretty sharp. And so, you know, they have a pretty strong professional self-concept, which is that I'm here to restrain myself with regard to whatever my commitments might be. And many of them had very strong commitments. We interviewed teachers who were committed conservatives, very, you know, enthusiastic progressives. But they know that that's something that they actually have to keep from their students. In some cases, they're committed to actually keeping it secret. You know, that's something that some teachers like to make sure they do. But I think that sense of duty as a teacher really equips them well to read the ideological messaging they might come across in a curricular resource. Yeah, on the quality question, you know, it gets back to John's notion about the training and about whether or not in their teacher training program have they had sufficient exposure to real history and good history and you know, graduate level discussions of history, and that should get that radar sharpened too. And I think it's unfortunately probably sharper for some teachers than others. So that would be my answer there.
I mean, the only thing I'd add there to what Nick said is, since Sam Weinberg's name came up earlier, his more recent work is about kids and the internet and their ability to judge the veracity or the political slant of a website. And it's extremely poor. And I thought of that as I was reading this report because I think what Nick said is right. I think the report indicates that teachers are pretty savvy about this and aware. And I would just like to see a much more concerted effort on their part to transmit that awareness to our students. You know, there are countries on this planet where starting first grade, students receive instruction and practice and how to discern what a real website is from a fake one. And America is getting into that game slowly, and we need to step it up.
So a little exercise when you go back to your office and you're sitting there having lunch with your colleagues. Ask your colleagues, how do you find out who controls a website? See how many of them know how you actually can look at any website and find out whose is this? Who built this? Who decides what's in here? Sam's argument is that most of them will not know.
Yeah, I just called Jim Grossman and asked him.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and he tells us.
So we only have a few minutes.
Yeah.
So policy priorities, which we usually don't do, but we're going to do today. So it's very clear that one of the policy priorities that the three of you and others would recommend is high-quality PD funding is one. Are there one or two other policy priorities that you would like this group to go back to their offices and think about and discuss with their colleagues, based, again, purely based on this report? We're not going to talk about anything else.
I've got one. More effort, more resource, more money to attract the very strongest, most able, best-read college students into the teaching profession. You know, there was a time in this country where teachers were drawn overwhelmingly from the highest achieving college students. And that time passed. And I want to revive it. And if that marks me as an elitist, fine. I think if you don't want that, you're not elitist enough.
So there are some of us who have argued, sometimes in print and sometimes not, that there is an explanation for why those are no longer our teachers.
The feminist revolution is one.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That once upon a time,
Yeah.
the smartest women in college became nurses and teachers rather than doctors and all sorts of other things because of the opportunity structure.
Right.
And now those opportunities are open to others. But part of the answer to that might actually lie in another question that came up and what we were talking about earlier, which is in terms of teachers reading what they find on the internet critically, which is another solution to that might be for education credentialing and degrees to be more of a liberal arts education than it is now. The extent to which the preparation of teachers is much less of a liberal arts education than the preparation for other disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are places in this country where if you were a history major going off to law school, you learn more history than if you're a person who's going to become a history teacher. And I think it's great people going to law school learn history. I think it's great for everyone to learn history, but it seems to me somewhat more urgent for the future history teacher to learn history. This is a problem.
I can add to that, Jim. I think the pre-service teacher training for history teachers, there is a good case here for kind of recommitting to history background, right? His teachers having a deep history background for all the obvious reasons. But I think that it also speaks to this dual need for history teachers. The ideal history instruction involves the kind of thinking work that historians do, along with deep content knowledge. And so when I say history teachers need to be trained deeply in history, it's not for just the content side, it's for both of those things, right? So that teachers, and this goes to the question you asked earlier about how teachers are making choices about online materials. I think one of the things that gnaws at me the most is that the most popular online source that you all identified is essentially an online textbook, right? John Green's videos are they're videotaped lectures, right? So it's the most traditional form of history instruction I can imagine. Students listening if my own son is an indication, at 2 times speed. Right? They're speeding them up. That's not a joke. That's for real.
Yeah, my students say I do that in the classroom. It's a problem.
They're speeding them up. And he's already fast. And they're jotting down notes as quickly as possible. And what's happening in their brains is they are taking information, writing down information so they can remember information, right? So I think this training history teachers better as historians will contribute not just to having background knowledge, but being able to make choices about what kinds of, there's an amazing wealth of digital resources out there where students can look at data in dynamic ways. Why aren't we using that more, right? Partly because people don't know that it's there or it's inaccessible to rooms, but partly because history teachers are walking into a room with paradigms about what history is and the pressure to get through content quickly, right? So those things are combining to push teachers into these decisions that are not leading to the best history instruction in classrooms.
Yeah, I'll add one last response to the policy front question, which is that, one of the things that we were most complementary of when we came across it in curriculum was the direct involvement of state and local history in the teaching of U.S. history. So finding a way to leverage the connections between local historical institutions, museums, libraries, historical societies, living history sites, national monuments and parks. These are physical parts of communities that bring history alive, and they are really, I think, they mitigate against a lot of this kind of broad brush generalization that happens in the poorer history lessons by showing you, hey, this is an actual battlefield, or this is a real settlement. These are things that you can learn about locally that bring this history to a lot more specific, context.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank everybody for your questions. I want to apologize that we did not get to all of them. Our three panelists are going to hang out a little bit, and you can ask those questions to them individually. I want to encourage all of you to go, as you're leaving, to the table outside the door. If you haven't looked at the handout, there's copies there. There are stickers, there are pens, there's information about the AHA's work. And we hope to see you at future briefings. We're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we will be resuming later in the year, probably in December. We've been thinking about a session in December on the history of the Congress, largely because there will be turnover in congressional staff. And so since everything has a history and it's useful to know the history, and I'm just quickly curious, how many of you would find a history of Congress to be useful, or would have found it useful when you started? Okay, Alex, there's an overwhelming vote here. But this also means that as we start up again, we are interested in hearing from you what you would like us to do. I would say that I would describe what we do as complementary to the Congressional Research Service. That's where you go when you want to find out something that you have to deal with, sometimes in 24 hours. And this is something different because it's purely historical, and you get to interact with our panel. So these are complementary services. This morning's session has been recorded. You can watch recordings of past briefings on the AHA's website, and I hope that you do, so you can get a sort of broader sense of the kind of things we can do and the ways in which we can help you. And when you go to our website, you are welcome to donate if you like. Thank you.